The Center for Research in Posthumanities, Bankura University presents a two-day international conference on posthuman condition in the Anthropocene, held on 2nd and March 3, 2024. Christopher Norris, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy, Cardiff University, is going to speak on Creativity Goes Posthuman? Some reflections on poetry and strong AI.
Professor Christopher Norris. Professor Norris is giving this talk for the second time, and he first gave his talk in our last conference, and it was on humanities at the crossroad, reconfiguring posthuman ethics, aesthetics, and politics. Professor Norris is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Cardiff University, a British philosopher and literary critic, earned his PhD in English from University College London in 1975. Initially, he delved into literary and music criticism, contributing to the now defunct magazine Records and Recording in the late 1970s. In 1991, Norris transitioned to the Cardiff Philosophy Department, where he later attained the title of Distinguished Research Professor in the Cardiff School of English, Communication and Philosophy in 1997. Throughout his career, he has held fellowships, visiting appointments at esteemed institutions such as University of California, Berkeley, the City University of New York, Norris University, and Dartmouth College. He is renowned globally for his expertise in deconstruction and the works of Jacques Derrida. Norris has authored numerous books and research articles covering diverse fields including literary theory, continental philosophy, philosophy of music, philosophy of language, philosophy of science. Recently, he has directed his focus towards the works of Alain Badiou, exploring intersections with both the analytic tradition, particularly analytic philosophy of mathematics, and the philosophy of Derrida. He is now a renowned poet and creative writer. I welcome Professor Christopher Norris. Professor Norris, the whole virtual platform is now all yours.
Thank you very much. Good, thank you. Yes, I've moved on now to writing poetry. Several kinds of poetry, political poetry especially, in the context of current British and world politics, but also philosophical verse. I no longer really hold to the beliefs I once held as a post-structuralist. I've changed my mind about verse, about the need for rhyme and meter, for formal structures, as means of investigation. I suppose I would say that I'm still doing philosophy, but I'm doing philosophy in a more creative, exploratory way. I'm using certain constraints of a structural nature, especially the constraint of rhyme, as, if you like, the portals of discovery, to give it a rather romantic description, a way of exploring language, concepts, the relationships between concepts, and the theoretical implications of poetic language when it's set against and compared with other kinds of language, other kinds of discourse, like philosophical discourse and scientific discourse. So it's a new departure in one sense in my work and the things I think about, but it's also one that takes up many of my old interests, including my interest in philosophy of science and philosophy of language. So I get to read this. I don't usually read lectures. I prefer to improvise, but this is in some ways a new field for me, and I wanted to say quite a lot and get it said clearly. So I shall read for once. As a poet, an academic philosopher, now retired, and a literary theorist from way back, I've more than once been asked what I think about the current debates around ChatGPT and other such smart AI applications in poetry and the creative arts. This obviously bears on the whole theme of posthumanism, because one of the sort of cutting-edge regions of that debate is precisely the extent to which certain kinds of machine or machine-based artificial intelligence might, well, depending on your point of view, encroach upon or might be new and exciting means of expanding the creative reach of human intelligence, so that there are positive and negative views of this. I'll stick to poetry for the obvious reason that that's what I know most about as a matter of practical as well as theoretical involvement. All the same, once philosophy arrives on the scene, it tends to broaden the issue to questions like, can AI think? And, if you grant that much, can AI think creatively, inventively, or in ways as strikingly profound and memorable as we find in the works of the greatest poets? Or again, won't it always be the case that any AI-generated poem or artwork will itself be the product of human intelligence creatively applied to technological resources, plus a massive database of texts, images, hypertext links, and so forth, that are likewise of human origin? In other words, freely adapting and reversing, but by no means contradicting, the well-known AI maxim, creative stuff out, creative stuff in. In other words, for any genuinely creative, striking, memorable poem, let's say, or line of poetry, there must have been some kind of creative input by human beings at a certain stage in producing that technology. On this view, it seems to be a flat choice. Whatever poetry you may get from ChatGPT and its rivals is either a work of creative imagination, in which case humanly, even if collectively, supplied, or else in some sense faked, simulated, or deceptively passed off as such. The latter sort of claim mostly rests on the assumption that it must, in the end, when you peel away all the contributory sources, turn out to have been algorithmically produced or created, with emphatic scare quotes, by a whole, maybe untraceable mass of existing AI-utilizable inputs. What we're getting here, in its latest guise, is something like Cartesian mind-body dualism, transposed to a context where mind equates with such preconceived positives as creativity, originality, and invention, while body, oddly enough, given the sensuous properties often attributed to the visual arts, poetry, music, is identified with everything mechanistic or lifeless. AI thus becomes the default repository of everything that must, on this view, be regarded as derivative from, or parasitical upon, technologies that embodied a certain kind of human creativity, the more routinely resourceful kind, and which therefore cannot be termed creative in a more than nugatory sense. In which case, conversely, instances of genuine creativity must be taken to include all and only those human artifacts that transcend their material technical conditions of production. They are assumed to manifest some human quality, not to say essence, that can issue only from the realm of mental, not physical, processes or events. Or again, lest that dualism be deemed prejudicial, given the anti-Cartesian slant of most present-day philosophy, on this view, such works cannot conceivably have their origin in silicon as distinct from carbon-based systems. This is all a fairly basic, if technologically updated, rerun of debates central to philosophical debate over the past 3 centuries and more. What gives it a new twist, and added topicality, is the way that poetry has lately become the go-to instance for many controversialists in quest of a test case to make their points either way. That is probably because a good many people, besides poets or dedicated readers of poetry, people like philosophers, cognitive scientists, AI engineers, software designers, programmers, coders, and so forth, will have some acquaintance with poetry and, quite likely, some poems that stick in their minds and that they treat as touchstones of the kind. They can now go online and spend as much time as they like reading samples of poetry that are, first, humanly authored, or second, based on a humanly authored original but AI modified, perhaps cast in a different verse form, meter, dialect, literary genre, and so forth. Or, the third alternative, they can be produced or created from scratch using inputs or instructions specifying certain broad parameters, but otherwise leaving the creative stuff to whatever resources the software does or doesn't have available for more or less tech-savvy uses. Poetry, the word poetry, then becomes a privileged term for whatever is conceived either as intrinsically beyond the powers of machine intelligence, or as what may not yet have been fully achieved, but should be thought of as achievable once AI has moved on to some as yet unrealized but attainable goal. Now, this whole issue has assumed something like crisis dimensions for some poets, as will be clear to anyone who surfs the relevant websites or Facebook pages. It might seem especially urgent for poets of a broadly formalist inclination, like myself, whose creative practices, rhyme, meter, verse forms of various kinds, would appear to be just the sort of thing that ChatGPT and its congenerics are most adept at taking on board. And indeed, when looking at some of the results thus produced, it is hard to deny that the software can do a remarkably good job of certain closely specified operations on existing poems. That is, of instructions like, turn this sonnet into a villanelle on the same topic, so 2 different verse forms, or write a ballad on the basis of themes given by the following key words. There's something like an emergent consensus amongst poets, or those willing to address a decidedly ticklish, not to say downright divisive issue, that AI in its currently top-rated versions puts up a creditable show of hitting off some verse forms, some prosodic features, and some generic features to pretty good effect when programmed to do so with sufficiently detailed instructions. It's also sometimes held by those with no obvious axe to grind that AI is far from self-evidently failing the test when asked to write, say, a poem of genre X with topic Y and in a stanza form based on the well-known piece of similar form by poet Z. To which the skeptics will predictably respond that the result in such cases is a product of all the inputs, resources, database trawling, and directive ingenuity invested in the project by various qualified and gifted human beings. I don't think this issue can be settled or even usefully moved on by philosophical arguments of an a priori or purely demonstrative type. That is not to say that they've not been advanced by reputable philosophers. Among the latter is John Searle, the American philosopher, who famously invented the Chinese room thought experiment. This asks us to imagine a non-Chinese, say English speaker, inside the room whose lack of the required, presumptively human linguistic competence is made up for by his having access to an AI system, along with comprehensive English language instruction manual and inbuilt resources for automatically returning a Chinese written response to written questions that are put to it, likewise in Chinese. The English-speaking subject simply takes in the questions without the least grasp of their Chinese characters, and having gone through the prescribed routine, hands back a correct, relevant, and grammatically well-formed set of answers. But, of course, ex hypothesi, he will not thereby show himself to possess intelligence, linguistic cultural understanding, or, least of all, consciousness, as in claims for strong AI. His answers will demonstrate nothing beyond what Searle deems the limit condition of any computational device, that is, a programmed or mechanical set of operations set up by a human team of hardware, software, and coding experts. Moreover, we shall always be in that situation as regards the supposedly benchmark half-century-old Turing test, where the computer comes back with plausibly human-sounding responses to questions asked by a human test subject who is then asked simply, human or non-human. We could never say for sure that those responses aren't just the product of clever technological advances that are finally down to the distinctively human intentions, purposes, interests, and motives of those who devised them. This appeal to intentions, or intentionality, as the essential mark of the human, has itself become a hallmark of the current pushback against what is seen as a slew of inflated and philosophically suspect claims for strong AI. I'm thinking here of philosophers like Hubert Dreyfus and Jerry Fodor and Searle himself. Searle's version of the case strikes me as a priori to the point of dogmatically refusing to believe that silicon-based systems, as opposed to carbon-based organisms, could ever, on pain of patent absurdity, be considered conscious in any sense of the word acceptable to knowing, willing, or intending, hence properly conscious, persons. Quite simply, short of appealing to the soul or some alternative, just as metaphysically loaded term, we are faced with the choice between Cartesian immaterialism, vis-à-vis the mind, and a position that takes adequate account of contemporary advances in neurophysiology, cognitive science, and scientifically informed psychology. There are, to be sure, less doctrinaire versions of Searle's case that do take successive AI developments into consideration, rather than falling back on his kind of anti-scientistic prejudice. They pay close attention to the phenomenology of humanly embodied intelligence, cognition, and consciousness. These envisaged as necessarily involving placement in a life world of shared perceptions, situations, experiences, interpersonal dealings, and, above all in this context, intentionality. I'm thinking here of Hubert Dreyfus's book about AI, machine intelligence, which has been regularly updated with a view to the most recent publications, scientific and from various humanities disciplines. For it's here that such thinkers most often rest their case for regarding strong AI as self-evidently a step too far in the anti-Cartesian drive to reduce mind or consciousness to mere epiphenomena of what goes on in the brain or the nervous system as a whole. However, these arguments also have their own very distinct philosophical parti pris. Behind the altogether creditable desire to avoid Searle-type dogmatism, there's a cleaving to intentionalist precepts that have their main source in the work of philosophers like Brentano, Husserl, and the phenomenological line of broadly mentalist, even sometimes idealist dissent. On the other side, in this latest round of basically post-Cartesian debate, are proponents of the extended mind thesis, very active focus of discussion recently. Proponents of the extended mind thesis, such as Andy Clark and Richard Menery, who take intentionality as having always, but more rapidly of late, undergone a process of technological extension, modification, and refinement. Thus, they argue, with thought experiments designed to back up their claim, that there is no philosophically defensible way of distinguishing between essentially human mental faculties and artificial adjuncts like notebooks, pencils, laptops, mobile phones, or GPS-based guidance systems, which have come to perform functions integral to our lives as beings required to navigate the worlds of memory, predictive planning, or experience generally. If human beings have one essential characteristic, it's their need, so these people argue, their need for tools, prostheses, or devices to compensate for their relative, compared to other species, smallness, weakness, slowness, sensory perceptual shortfall, or such like creaturely limitations. And that goes just as much, maybe more, for the cognitive, intellectual, creative aspects of human experience, compared with the physical, bodily aspects. For it's there that technology has intervened decisively to show how misinformed or simplistic that Cartesian distinction is, or how deep and integral the relation between external prostheses of this type and those traits and capacities we take to constitute our always revisable human life world. What has all this to do with poetry, creativity, and the sorts of AI cognizant debate that have recently agitated so many online forums? More to the point, why should poetry occupy such a central position when the claims of ChatGPT and its rivals are more clearly a major source of anxiety for educators at every level of coursework assessment, from school to university and beyond. Or again, where the question, did you actually yourself, without AI assistance, think up or work out or invent or conceive or imagine this piece of work, has a very real and urgent practical import beyond the satisfaction of desire for recognition on such laudatory terms. To this, I'd offer three answers in ascending order of philosophical and creative significance. The first, as I've said, is the role of intentionality on both sides of this debate. Intentions have long preoccupied literary critics and theorists, especially with regard to poetry, where a long-standing ancient romantic modernist tradition of thought has treated poems as, in some sense, possessed of meanings beyond anything willed or knowingly entertained by the poet in the process of creation. Whatever the truth of this venerable notion, it's one that captures an experience shared by many poets and responsive readers. I count myself among them, though while I'm writing, I feel there's a good deal of conscious, intentional, even deliberative thought involved, even though it's the choices of, for instance, meter, rhyme scheme, and so forth, that on good days open the portals of discovery by channeling thought in unexpected ways. So the experience of writing a poem, if it's a good one, if it's not a prose poem, let's say, is that certainly intentionality comes into it. You're aware of making choices, you're aware of choosing between possibilities in ways that the poem may develop. But if it works as a poem, then it is going to generate some impression of having been a gift, not the poet's gift so much as the gift of language, something that language makes possible in certain states of sort of semi-suspended consciousness where language can work its, if you like, its magic. So the vocabulary becomes a little blurry here. So it's a balance between, or a very complex interaction between conscious and non-conscious, or perhaps pre-conscious states. Thus, when literary theorists denounce the so-called intentional fallacy and insist that we focus strictly on the words on the page, they do have a certain, albeit overstated, point to make. On the other hand, I think there is a certain presence of mind, if you want to call it that, you can call it intentionality, that influences those choices and that makes it reasonable on methodological as well as creative psychological grounds to suppose the presence of authorial interests and motives that allow us to make optimal sense of those words. Nor is this merely a compromise settlement on terms more or less acceptable to both sides, for it also applies to the everyday matter of what we do habitually, although remarkably, when we talk straight ahead in everyday contexts and get our intended gist across in semantically, grammatically, and pragmatically adequate ways. So there's something about the miraculous event of an ordinary speech act that is moving already in the direction of what we think of as poetic inspiration. We don't have any fixed or preset intention to say exactly what we're going to say. We can only know once we've said it whether we've successfully communicated our gist, our intention. In this case, as with poems, we start out with that vaguely formulated gist, and we then proceed to get the sense across in more or less adequate measure, as judged once we've spoken, reviewed what we said, and seen how far that sense lived up to our communicative purposes. However rough and ready this description of the process, it at least tries to grasp what's going on, rather than the kind of prematurely defeatist mystery mongering preferred by doctrinaire anti-intentionalists. William Empson's landmark book of literary criticism, 7 Types of Ambiguity, which came out in 1930, was the first study to raise these issues to a high point of critical philosophical visibility. It's an extraordinary book which I recommend to your attention if you're interested in poetry and the way that poetry works on us. An early reviewer of 7 Types of Ambiguity, James Smith, picked up on it in a way that relates very strikingly to my topic here. The curious thing about Empson's unprecedentedly detailed, complex, and resourceful, not to say inventive or at times over-ingenious close readings, was whether the poem or passage concerned was treated as a noumenon or a phenomenon. A noumenon is an intentional entity. It's something that has irreducible reference to a state of mind, an intention, or a mental state, as distinct from a physical state. So it's at the center of debates about mind-body and Cartesian dualism. Did the critic approach those semantic complexities as giving us access to a mind in the process of creation? That is, a poet with all her thoughts, feelings, experiences, mind states, and, crucially, intentions? Or did it not rather detach the poem from that life-world context and treat it as an intricate verbal construct offered to the reader duly skilled in deciphering such constructs, and properly disabused of such extraneous concerns? So is the poem an object, something out there, objectively there on the page? As the American New Critics thought, for instance. They spoke of the verbal icon and the concrete universal. And they were very fierce about the intentional fallacy. They thought it was quite impermissible, quite wrong and misguided to talk about a poet's intentions, because all we have is the poem on the page. So they thought. So they regarded any talk of intentions as being a fallacy. We are here very close to the issues debated by those who either proclaim or deny that strong AI may already or might very soon be within the gates of human intelligence and creativity. James Smith, the early reviewer, asks Empson, quote, "Is the ambiguity referred to that of life? Is it a bundle of diverse forces bound together only by their coexistence? Or is it that of a literary device, of the allusion, conceit, or pun in one of their more or less conscious forms? If it's the former, broadly phenomenal sort of thing, then Empson must plainly, so Smith thinks, be wrong. For, quote again, a poem is not a mere fragment of life, it is a fragment that has been detached, considered, and judged by a mind. A poem is a noumenon rather than a phenomenon." Okay? And if it is the second, in Smith's somewhat skewed rendition, then, quote, "at least we can say that Mr. Empson's thesis is exaggerated." By this he must mean that if all the ambiguities uncovered by Empson are indeed noumenal, products of conscious, willed, or intentional thought, then the thesis attributes such powers to the poet as can scarcely be credited, unless in terms of divine inspiration. To which Empson breezily responds that, quote, "as I remember, one of the best-known short poems by Blake, William Blake, the pre-romantic poet, is actually crossed out in the notebook, which is the only source of it." So Blake had second thoughts and decided he didn't want that poem published. Thus, the poet's intent, his final deliberative choice in the matter, was to do away with the poem altogether. But the poem remained with its meanings intact, despite and against his wishes. Yet, Empson goes on, quote, "this is only part of the difficulty as to knowing whether a poem is a noumenon or a phenomenon. Critics have long been allowed to say that a poem may be something inspired, which meant more than the poet knew, as in ancient invocations of the muse. And, later romantic poets were very close to imagining some kind of divine or humanly transcendent noumenal power of inspiration. The Blake anecdote seems to me less pertinent than the point about noumenon versus phenomenon, and the connection made between that distinction and the role once supposed to be played by superhuman agency in certain especially valued kinds of poetry. That connection is brought out even more clearly by Empson's wavering, even conflicted, attitude to the whole question of poetic intention, whether it is there for the reader's retrieval, and if so, whether we should wish to retrieve it. Seven Types of Ambiguity was from the outset regularly held up by scholar critics as a cautionary instance of what went wrong when a highly gifted but overactive or excessively inventive intelligence was let loose on poetry of its own, no doubt, shrewdly selective choosing. For James Smith, this shows Empson treating the poem as itself a phenomenon, something out there and object-like, but also as a welcome pretext for the exercise of his own highly developed noumenal capacities. The US New Critics in the 1940s and 50s learned a lot about close reading from William Empson, although they, like Smith, very often objected to what they saw as his habit of foisting his own super subtle readings onto poems that were thereby rendered incapable of speaking for themselves. But in their case, paradoxically, this went along with rejecting Empson's later vigorously argued appeals to authorial intention and the need to take account of it, as against the new critic's dogmatic claim that poetic intentions were private, forever unknowable, and hence no part of the critic's legitimate concerns. So Empson ended up by agreeing with Smith on this much at least, that poetry, like all our linguistic dealings, could only be understood insofar as we attempted, with whatever degree of success, to figure out the poet's intentions. My point in all this is that opponents of strong AI, whether dogmatically opposed like Searle or from a more nuanced phenomenological standpoint, may not be quite as secure as they think when appealing to intention or intentionality as the intrinsic mark of the human, and hence as that which must ultimately lie behind all appearances of silicon-based intelligence. What the case of poetry makes especially clear is that it can be much harder than they believe to establish, locate, maintain, and uphold such distinctions as those between subject and object, noumenon and phenomenon, noesis and noema in Husserlian terminology, or meaning conceived as there in the words on the page, and meaning conceived as a process involving each of those pairs in a constant, conceptually unstable exchange of polarities, which is very much the lesson of some of Husserl's work. This was Empson's conclusion in Seven Types of Ambiguity, and that book does as much to bear it out as any work of philosophy that I've come across, rather. Skeptics about artificial intelligence are right in holding with William James that, quote, the trail of the human serpent is over everything, or that intentionality is in play whenever human beings engage with computers, hardware or software, concepts, marks on pages, poems, critical comments, or anything else that falls beneath their mental gaze. But they are not, or not so obviously, right, when they draw from this the, to them, desired conclusion that those items across such a range of material, technological, phenomenal, noumenal, conceptual, and abstract realms, things like numbers, for instance, must all be regarded as having their properties exhaustively covered by the term intentional object. When extended that far, the term tells us nothing about the items beyond the truism that human cognitive capacities come into it as soon as the items in question capture our attention, just as the serpent's trail lies over everything that it has slithered over. What the realist will say in response, and you can count me a realist in this regard, is that they continue to exist, those things, and exert their diverse properties and powers in different ways and to different extents, depending on just how far their existence is the product of human intelligence, inventiveness, or creativity. And of course, that whole question of the relation between the powers, the intrinsic powers of objects, of various things on every physical scale, from the micro to the macro, that we have dealings with, and the human powers that are exerted upon them that sometimes bring them into existence, like transuranic elements in particle colliders, that there's a very complex interplay at various points. Nevertheless, the realist would want to hang on to that distinction insofar as there must be objects that do continue to exert their powers and their properties and their balances and so forth, independent of human intervention. After all, as I've remarked, the human species is not only highly adaptable and ingenious in cultural technological terms, but also strikingly, perhaps uniquely, prosthetic in nature. That is, reliant on external devices, including extracranial supplements to memory and other mental powers, to get around and to generally cope with life. So it's well to take a longer historical view and place this current, somewhat overpolarized debate in a time-wise less parochial context. Smart AI is the latest development in a process of jointly scientific, technological, and cultural creative change, which, returning to poetry as our main topic, has taken us from the earliest writing systems in their function as mnemonic resources for conserving the contents of oral tradition, via the printing press and word processing, to a stage where this new arrival is creating such a flurry of excitement and a concern That poets are so worried about it is, I think, a consequence of poetry occupying such an eminently contested or conflictual space between the claims of, on the one hand, technique, structure, material traces, and sensory or phenomenal attributes, and on the other, meanings, senses, feelings, implications, metaphorical associative properties, and of course authorial intentions, whether recognized or dismissed as a matter of critical interpretive precept. It helps to explain why issues in this area have for so long been topics of intense, even fierce dispute, concerning, for instance, poetic intention, knowable or unknowable, or the imputed ontological status of the poem, phenomenal or noumenal, or indeed the character of poetic utterance, cognitive, propositional, emotional, associative. Or indeed, back to the matter in hand, the question as to whether the advent of arguably strong AI is a threat, a promise, or an overhyped latest addition to poetry's long-standing stock of creative resources. The anxiety felt by some poets when they first encounter one of the more impressive results of ChatGPT processing is reminiscent of that felt a century back by William Empson's contemporaries, poets and critics, when they first encountered 7 types of ambiguity. At that time, this was mostly voiced as a deep distaste for analysis, or at least for the kind of verbal analysis, detailed, tenacious, logically acute, yet often, especially in the later chapters of the book, pressing logic to its limit point in paradox or aporia, that made the book so controversial. Prominent among the dissenters, the unfavourable reviewers and critics, were those who thought of literary criticism as primarily or properly an appreciative account of the pleasures and rewards that poetry offered to readers not overly concerned with such specialist matters. After all, their enjoyment might well be spoiled by any excess of analytical rigour that risked exposing, hence potentially destroying, its sources or subjective effects. Empson responded very much in character by attributing to these sensitive souls the view that analytically inclined literary critics are all of them rather like dogs, but come in 2 kinds. Those who, quote, merely relieve themselves against the flower of beauty, and those less continent who afterwards scratch it up, unquote. Empson was very fond of dogs. The word dog comes in for some very insightful historical commentary in his later work. Empson would later have a lot more to say about dogs and about the transition from negative to positive dog sentiment between roughly Shakespeare's time and Darwin's as an index of progressive secularism, humanism, and naturalistic rationalism. In 7 Types of Ambiguity, it's clear that the critic as dog is already something of a hero in both irreverent roles, since the flower of beauty, as Empson conceives of it, is a pretty tough plant, not a wilting weed, and is likelier to benefit than to suffer from such analytical scratching. One can readily detect the same fears and insecurities at work among the more aggressive defensive responses to ChatGPT, as among those poetry readers alarmed at the advent of the high-powered Empsonian verbal analysis. What they feared was the large-scale intrusion of one kind of mind state into another, the basically prosaic mind state of rational, intellectual, conceptual, or consecutive thought, into the mind state of feeling, emotion, affect, or, in short, that which, by its very nature, eludes formulation in such analytically accountable terms. What seems to be the chief fear among poets at present is likewise the prospect that thought of the conceptual analytic sort may be about to stage a further raid on the inarticulate, better to say the rationally inarticulable, and exploit its newfound technological resources in the final achievement or conquest of creativity, that most human of human attributes. I should say that I am by no means immune to such misgivings, and would share those fears if smart AI presented any epochal challenge of the kind envisaged. For that challenge would most likely involve a massive and disabling assault, not only on the cherished self-image of poets, composers, and visual artists, but also on a range of humanly indispensable values, principles, and ethical convictions. Because the the role of intentionality, judgment, responsibility for what one says or what speech acts one utters, is within fairly close distance of the question of ethical responsibility for our acts, the consequences of our acts, and for those actions themselves. In other words, the space that humanist thinkers try to reserve for human intentionality, mentality in general, has some ethical bearings, as for instance in the very complicated relationship between aesthetic judgment and ethical judgment in Kant. So these are large questions with very real and quite far-reaching human consequences. As should be clear by now, I don't think the issue has to be framed in anything like such extreme and discomforting terms. For one thing, it ignores the way in which, as all practicing poets must know, creativity involves a great deal of criticism. That is, a constant and often long-drawn process of rereading, assessing, revising, and sometimes rejecting successive draft versions of a poem. It's one of the sad things about the current electronic media is that very few texts are preserved in that way. Notebooks, poets' notebooks, the record of corrections, strikings through revisions, sometimes wholesale rewrites of poetry. Of course, most of that is now done electronically, and so the drafts get swallowed up and lost. They can't be identified any longer. So the constant two-way process of exchange between the creative and the critical impulse of poetry writing. This is why Empson is so much a poet's critic as well as a poet critic or a critic poet. Empson also wrote poetry in his early years. It's also what gives his words a more than jocular import when, as Seven Types begins to treat some of the most complex and deep-rooted instances of poetic ambiguity, he pauses to caution the reader that, quote, "We are here approaching the most secret places of the muse." It's partly a slightly arch joke, really, about a certain view of what poetry is and does. Along with a gentle swipe at the overly reverential, appreciative critics, Empson's remark makes the point that poetic inspiration may have sources more accessible to analysis than one still very influential tradition, from Longinus to the Romantics and beyond, would have us believe. That Freudian psychoanalysis and Russell-inflected linguistic analysis both leave their imprint on Seven Types of Ambiguity is a clear sign that, so far as he's concerned, those secret places of the muse are at least periodically open to visits by the meddlesome, prosaic, analytic mind. And the Freudian presence is as much a pointer to the muse, or to the Eleusinian mysteries, as to the supposedly arid and disenchanted precincts of Empsonian verbal exegesis. Transpose these issues to the present-day context of debates around ChatGPT, and the parallels are not far to seek. In both cases and on both sides, there's heavy investment in a certain idea of what counts or doesn't count as poetry, creativity, imagination, originality, authorship, and underlying all these, the human. To those undisturbed or indeed excited by the latest advances in AI software, especially vis-a-vis the arts and humanities, the above concepts, along with their traditional evaluative weightings, can and should be modified, extended, probably transformed, if they're not to be abandoned as simply outdated and irrelevant. To those unconvinced by such claims, or half-convinced and appalled by the prospect, the concepts and practices that inform them remain of vital importance if humanity is to survive with anything like its ethical, social, cultural, and aesthetic values still in place. To them, it portends nothing less than catastrophe, that the bounds and scope of what constitutes the human should be so far questioned as to count the current claims for smart AI as even up for serious, informed debate. It seems to me that once the dust around these issues has settled a bit, there will emerge something like a broad consensus that any threat they pose to the arts, the humanities, or human creativity will be a lot less serious or potentially harmful than in fields like medicine, psychiatry, and law, where the exercise of judgment has far more direct consequences for better or worse. Of course, judgment has a central role in the writing of poetry, as witness all those discarded drafts or multiple stages of revision, and also with whatever degree of emphasis in the criticism of poetry. But judgment is already very much in play when poets, critics, philosophers, and others take a look at the poems produced, processed, revised, extended, or generically modified by AI software. This may lead them to pronounce, as they are already doing, often with great confidence and gusto, on the comparative merits of various samples, whether human-authored, AI-generated, or some combination of the two. There's been much debate around the question, can AI be intelligent, but nothing like as much around the equally, perhaps in this context, more relevant question, can AI exercise judgment? Posed in this form, the issue goes as deep as any in the history of philosophy and raises problems that have often been broached in a question-begging way, then quickly swept onto the carpet of reassured methodological or analytic grasp. Such is Kant's treatment in all three of his critiques, where judgment, Urteilskraft, is thought of as somehow mysteriously bridging all manner of gaps in the grand architectonic of the faculties. Thus it's wheeled on to explain how intuitions are brought under concepts, or how two such utterly disparate mental operations might achieve synthesis by way of a joint activity that involves both judgment and imagination. This latter described as, quote, an art, this is Kant, an art buried in the depths of the soul, which, though itself unknowable, is nonetheless prerequisite to any knowledge whatsoever. In the Critique of Practical Reason, it makes another appearance as that which, just as obscurely, enables particular instances of ethical judgment to claim warrant from, or again be brought under, high-level abstract principles like the categorical imperative. And in the aesthetically oriented critique of judgment, it has the analogous role of a faculty that subsumes the evaluative responses of individual viewers, readers, or listeners under generalized principles like aesthetic disinterest or formal purposiveness without purpose, in order to secure both the autonomy of art and the autonomy of judgment itself. Kant's wrestling with this issue has been one of many problems that he sought to resolve in an epoch-changing way, but which he only succeeded in rendering more deeply opaque and paradox-ridden. His treatment has left open that entire range of gaps and conceptual lacunae which continue to plague thinking in areas as diverse as epistemology, philosophy of science, ethics, aesthetics, and not least philosophy of mind, including what the latter has to say with regard to developments in AI. If Kant's great enterprise, his attempt to think the system of the faculties in all their complex relations and interdependencies, turned out to contain these residual yet crucial, since load-bearing, weak points at various junctures, then the unresolved issue of judgment is one that both sides of the smart AI debate would do well to approach more thoughtfully. Then the current debate around poetry and AI might provide some useful insights into how the issue impinges on other domains, such as law and psychiatry, where professional dilemmas will increasingly arise at points of conflict between rule and exception, precept and instance, or that which conformably falls under and that which eludes or exceeds the compass of present conceptual grasp. For what Kant gave us to think, despite his system-building and problem-solving claims, was the inherence of judgment at every point, including, looking forward, those points where humanity encounters a challenge to the autonomy so anxiously defended in Kant's three critiques. The phrase smart AI rather skews the issue in this regard, since it's so kind-specific in its usage and scope of deployment. Thus, it denotes just the kind of intelligence that fares best in the kind of forum where the kinds of achievement that count are, as I've said, judgment plays such a large part in creativity and allows us to give rationality a decent look in, refuge in obscurity, by suggestively importing quasi-mystical notions of creation ex nihilo, or in spot are regarded as dangerously prone to schismatic religious and political abuses. Judgment's in there at every stage in our human dealing with poems, people, hardware, software, AI claims and counterclaims, and in short, wherever you look on terrain that's already trodden into ruts by partisans on either side. It's also there, materially embodied or encoded, in the AI hardware and software, at least when considered as products of human judgment or evaluation, concerning the various objectives, priorities, and short or long-term possibilities that present themselves from time to time. Recognizing this, and since the AI and poetry debate touches on so many long-standing issues in philosophy, it's worth considering just how far the new technology shifts the ground as regards human autonomy and freedom, or the preferred self-image by which humanity has cultivated those ideals. Poetic autonomy is often conceived after the manner of the self-shaping envisaged by those of an etymological bent, who reduced the Greek verb poein, to produce, fashion, or shape, in support of their claim. This treats poetry as a mode of self-creation, deeply akin to the process of development toward autonomous selfhood that typifies the life well lived. Western humanism, from the ancient Greeks to Michel Foucault, and tends to find favour, especially at times like the European Romantic period, of cultural artistic revolt against what's perceived as a threat of a creeping scientific rationalism. It's not hard to see signs of this in the current round of AI discussion, among them the sense that poetry has assumed for some the role of last sanctum or redoubt for all that makes us human. But as I've said, that idea comes under strain from the copious evidence of how far technology in the form of extracranial, mnemonic, computational, and verbal compositional resources has entered many spheres of many human expressive activities, poetry included. Slippery slope arguments are not always helpful and sometimes actively misleading, but it's far from clear that there is a qualitative as opposed to a quantitative break on the scale that has print rhyming dictionaries and rhyme zone at one end and smart AI at the other. To be sure, a human being is, or has been up to now, responsible for how the rhymes are deployed, along with numerous other aspects of meter or verse form or prosodic and syntactic structure. But ChatGPT is already doing rather well on those counts, at least in some cases, according to some judges, and it looks like being able to enhance the work of poets, using that term with studious neutrality, whose native abilities could use such help. Dyslexic people, for instance, can run their poems through smart AI or through one or other program and get the grammar tidied up, which helps because it means you can appreciate the interaction between syntax and verse rhythms, which is one of the chief sources of strong poetic effects. And if that is the case, then technological assistantism undergoes the mooted qualitative, tactic, prosodic, generic, and so forth, in the absence of which a poem would scarcely count as such, even in the case of so-called free verse, where there must be something to distinguish it from prose. What is singular, inhabiting that zone of indistinction between language as intentional utterance and language as in various ways exceeding or preempting the speaker's enunciative grasp. Jacobson, the linguist, shows, through the presence of a great, indeed amazing range of signifying structures that linguists would normally attribute to la langue or to any given language as a paradigm class of differential contrasts and relations. These enable the system, but are not to be found actually there in the everyday speech acts or items of parole, which necessarily draw on them as conditions of or expressive intent of speakers and listeners. In poetry, conversely, they're projected, as Jacobson phrases it, from the axis of selection onto the axis of combination, or from the paradigmatic to the syntagmatic dimension of language. That's to say, poetry exhibits a formal tendency, more or less marked according to genre, theme, period of composition, toward the intensive use of features like extended metaphor, alliteration, assonance, parallelism, syntactic inversion, and other departures from the routine currency of prose discourse. To that extent, the poem is to proceed from, perish the thought, systemic operations beyond the knowing grasp of even the best equipped, most lucidly self-aware poet. None of this is to suggest that poets or readers are dupes if they buy into outmoded romantic ideas like poetic inspiration, visionary power, expressive depth, emotional import, or, as new critics and post-structuralists would say, authorial intent. Rather, it means that poetry has long had active, inventive, and self-renewing interactions with a great range of linguistic phenomena, aside from the straightforwardly intentional expressive, that have contributed greatly to its range of resources for achieving imaginative ends. Rhyme-driven poetry is just one example of the way that language, in its phonetic, semantic, and etymological dimensions, can open up realms of creative possibility far beyond anything attainable in the course of prose discourse, or indeed of free verse, if that oxymoron be allowed. Just as poets use all manner of past and existing techniques by way of practical assistance, even on occasion as prompts or stimulants toward previously unthought of ideas, so too they'll most likely make use of smart AI in its future stages of development. Eventually, once current anxieties subside, it may well be seen as a powerful, at times somewhat uncanny, but on the whole creatively beneficial way of exercising judgment on, in, and through the interplay of human and AI resources. Another effect that may be felt in time is the revaluation of literary criticism and theory in relation to poetry. These disciplines have often suffered the curious mixed blessing of a discourse presumed more theoretically or philosophically knowing than its object of study, that is poetry, yet for just that reason held in lower esteem, since lacking poetry's access to higher, more... After all, as seems self-evident, literary criticism depended on literature, and especially on poetry, for whatever strictly derivative interest criticism, might hear that critics, Empson among them, are more creatively gifted and, let's say, more irreplaceable as writers than some of the poets they write about. The advent of a smart AI might, as I've suggested, serve to clarify the degree to which criticism, including self-criticism, has always been a vital aspect of any worthwhile poetic achievement. It may also help to make the point, after John Maynard Keynes, the economist, that those who purport to do without any theory are usually in the grip of a bad old theory whose disastrous effects will soon catch up with them. This is basically Empson's rationale, and it's the kind of thinking that best makes acceptable sense of what's otherwise apt to strike poets and readers as a wholly unprecedented rationalist or scientistic trespass on imagination's elective home ground. At the same time, poets may feel themselves obliged, at any rate challenged or driven, to up their game in various ways according to the kind of poetry they write and the quality of work they aspire to. Versifiers and formalists will find, are indeed finding already, that smart AI can do a more than competent job of producing rhymed and metrical verse, and of composing, though why not say creating, so long as the word is freed from its ideological baggage, poems in such genres as the sonnet, villanelle, or double sestina. Those who continue to deploy such forms may need to come up with inventive ways of refreshing them, whether by marked departures from the norm as regards thematic content, style, or idiom, or else through the kinds of metatextual device, such as title, epigraph, or marginal note, that presents them in an unfamiliar guise. Others of a less formalist persuasion will think this a needlessly circuitous route, and prefer to meet the AI challenge by simply dispensing with those too easily replicable verse structures or generic traits, and instead taking the free verse option, or seeking alternative ways to mark off poetry from prose. Either way, the awareness of smart AI and its rapidly evolving capabilities will involve a degree of adaptive ingenuity on the poet's part, and a mindset attuned to kinds of inventiveness that, in some cases, will have as good a claim to poetic creativity as more traditional modes. At any rate, the thing is here and likely to stay around as long as our civilization lasts. So poets had best start figuring out how best to respond. Thanks very much, and sorry I went on a little bit longer than I was supposed to.
Thank you, Professor Norris, for this enriching talk. Now I open this session to question, answer, observation from our audience. I would request you to write your question and observation in the chat box, and Professor Norris will be happy to answer them.
Is it okay to post questions live?
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, yeah.
Okay. Wow. Fantastic. Combining all this GTP items, poetry, creativity, philosophy. phenomenology, Kant. I got the following thought there, and I'm interested if I can make it intelligible for you. So Kant, in his A edition, he talks about three faculties: the faculty of intuition, the faculty of conceptualization, and in between, the faculty of imagination, the productive imagination. That kind of disappears in the B edition. Then later Heidegger digs it up again in his phenomenological interpretation of Kant's critique, and he connects it with Husserl's capacity of empty intending, which is a sui generis kind of capacity that's itself mysteriously creative also. So if I'm making sense so far, I'm trying to figure out if the difference between maybe human creativity and artificial creativity has to do with the difference that these philosophers see between productive imagination and reproductive imagination. And the reproductive imagination is really like, the recombination of already existing items, and which can give, something of a surprising combination. And that is what AI seems to do. It just plucks from everywhere, wherever it finds structures and concepts and recombines them, and is of course totally not aware of what it is doing. So it has no empty intentionality in its procedure. But productive imagination, and I'm also here going back to Paul Ricoeur in his ideas about narrativity. He goes back also to Kant, saying like, the way we understand a plot in a story or even in a poem is dependent on this productive imagination. That is the deeper source that gives meaning, to what we are taking in. If I'm making sense so far, I'd like your feedback on that idea.
Yeah, well, I think, yes, all those Kantian and post-Kantian debates and distinctions and binaries have returned to haunt the discourse around strong AI. It got into English criticism by Coleridge, and Coleridge tried to make out the distinction between wit, which was roughly what you were referring to as the merely combinatory power of intelligence, to put together ideas in perhaps novel, more or less intriguing and mind-catching sort of combinations, as opposed to the imagination. And Coleridge tried to, in a way, go beyond Kant by making more precise that distinction between what he called wit and imagination. But the kinds of examples he chose rather tended to undermine that case, I think. I mean, if you look at the subsequent history of those remarks, what he says about the metaphysical poets of the 17th century, which, who as far as he was concerned, were simply exemplars of wit. All they were doing was taking ideas, reassembling them, creating sometimes strikingly incongruous relations between them. But he saw that as still being confined to the relatively subaltern faculty of wit. Then imagination, he said, and he's following Kant in this, although he's often accused of getting Kant very wrong. The imagination was exemplastic. It brought things together in wholly new forms. It created new forms out of them. It was at times he's running very close to giving it divine status, in fact, a kind of repetition of God's primal act of creation. It becomes very, very purple, his prose. But so does Kant's, of course, at that point. This art buried in the depths of the soul, whose operations can never be understood, but without whose operations we could never put two thoughts together. The subsequent history of that distinction is one of successive attempts to make sense of it in more adequate terms, which have themselves got mired in sort of vaguely gestural, metaphorical language. So I think one beneficial thing about the AI debate might be that we finally got a piece of technology that might enable us to actually keep some sort of check on just how far the best products of AI assisted human ingenuity, if you want to call it, rather than creativity, can in fact produce imaginative products in various genres, including music, which do strike us as having the imaginative power of, of the music of Beethoven or Bach or Bruckner, or whoever you want to name. But I do think it's a kind of, well, to borrow the Kantian term, it's a kind of replication in the, in the subsequent discourse of distinctions that have this this elusive quality about them, that you can formulate them up to a certain point, and it's usually the point where Kant would have spoken of, well, where Coleridge speaks of wit. It is the more or less resourceful and ingenious recombination of existing ideas. But as soon as they start gesturing toward this transcendent power that will really account for human creativity and set it apart from anything machine, anything that could be replicated by machine, then it becomes very metaphorical and fuzzy. It's reduced to pointing to touchstones of the kind, as Coleridge does say with Shakespeare.
No, I would agree that it would be very hard to conceptualize that capacity, of course, and see differences. That's. I'm just starting to do a little experimenting with GPT, and I had some hilarious results also sometimes, because sometimes it's going totally in a weird direction or makes weird mistakes. I do have a little, so you will have some experience with that. So ChatGPT created poems seem to be quite accessible. I might be wrong in that, but and if they're not accessible, could you ask ChatGPT then say, well, what do you mean? And is it then coming up with something as if it has intentionality, with something of a clarification? Yeah.
I think very often arguments that present themselves as being based on fundamental distinctions between categories like, well, say, wit and imagination, turn out to be much more subject to the vagaries of cultural taste. I mean, Coleridge took it pretty much for granted, because a lot of his readers would have done, that the metaphysical poets of the 17th century, Donne especially, were sort of interesting but extravagant, far-fetched. He often sounds like Dr. Johnson, really, when he writes about the metaphysicals. Whereas I was brought up at school to think of the metaphysical poets as being the central examples of imagination at full stretch, really, really powerfully. Non-prosaic poems, if you like, poems that went to the heart of human creativity because they created such startling and memorable juxtapositions of incongruous ideas. And I grew up with the idea that is what constituted good poetry, full stop, which was synonymous with imaginative rather than merely witty poetry. But for Coleridge, as I say, it was an example of one way that poetic ingenuity went, but didn't produce good poetry. Well, actually, he was much less dogmatic about that than some of his contemporaries, and he responded much better to the really metaphysical bits of Shakespeare, for instance, than most of his contemporaries did. But I think there's always going to be a large element of cultural preference involved, which really prevents, or at least it makes it very difficult to get back to sort of fundamental principles or distinctions. So you can't rely on terms like imagination and well, Coleridge's term was fancy. Fancy was the merely combinatory faculty, whereas imagination was, well, like a repetition of the creative act of God in the finite mind, Coleridge says. And then he breaks it off, and he pretends that he was interrupted in this train of thought. And I think what he felt, because this is the elder Coleridge, who was becoming very orthodox in his Christian belief, and so he felt this was getting a bit too close to blasphemy for his liking. So, but he was certainly running close to making what would, in that context, have been blasphemous claims for the imagination.
Because in the end, there might be no difference, actually.
Sorry,
in the end, there might be no difference. We might just be AI machines ourselves, of course.
Well, yeah, if you think of the words, the word wit, well, yeah. I mean, wit, it comes from Vitan, doesn't it? Anglo-Saxon Vitan, which covered just about every aspect of intelligence, including insight, intuition, perceptiveness. Yeah, it was a much larger and more sort of impressive verb. Yeah. As for the machine, well, I don't know. I mean, in some sense, it does strike me that people like Searle are, if you get too a prioristic about it, then I think you're on a sticky wicket, so to speak. Partly because we can't know a priori just what developments might yet turn up in strong AI, in software or in hardware or software. I mean, to claim some kind of privileged philosophical insight into the essential and irreducible difference between human mentality and machine mentality is to stake much too large a claim on the current limits of technical achievement.
Yeah,
So
but that's what we philosophers do anyway.
Yes.
It's their job in a way, isn't it?
Yeah. I think we're out of time, but thank you so much. It was very stimulating, a fantastic presentation. And I hope it will be published so I can share it with my friends who are interested in literature. Thank you so much.
It's coming out in a journal called Substance, American journal, with a poem about AI. Oddly enough, they agreed to publish both of them. So, yeah. But I think it'll be interesting to see which way this debate goes, and it'll depend very largely on the quality of the poems that turn up. And there'll always be the uncertainty as to whether whether people are actually using AI, whether they admit it or not, or whether they want to, whether they proudly display the fact that they are. Yeah, the examples I've seen work best, like I said in the paper, that when they work with a fixed form, if you put in, sonnet or villanelle or terzerima or sestina, and give a few key terms, yeah, then you get some interesting results out. So far, I've been able to tell that they're machine generated with every example I've looked at. But that's most often because it picks up a bit of text that it's simply turned up in one of its trawls. And so you recognize it straight away as being derivative.
Thank you, Professor Norris, for this insightful talk. We formally end this session here, and have a nice day, Professor Norris.
Thank you. Thanks. I can come back in later, can I?
Sure.